Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, Consciousness, Force and Understanding, Appearance and the Supersensible World, continued. Thus, in contrast to specific laws, we have universal attraction or the pure notion of law. Insofar as this pure notion is looked on as the essence, or the true inner being, the determinateness of the specific law itself still belongs to appearance, or rather to sensuous being. But the pure notion of law transcends not merely the law, which being itself a specific law, stands contrasted with other specific laws, but also transcends law as such. The determinateness of which we spoke is itself really only a vanishing moment, which can no longer occur here as something essential, for here it is only the law that is the true, but the notion of law is turned against law itself. That is to say, in the law the difference itself is grasped immediately and taken up into the universal, thereby, however, giving the moments whose relation is expressed by the law a subsistence in the form of indifferent and merely implicit essentialities. But these parts of the difference present in the law are at the same time themselves determinate sides. The pure notion of law as universal attraction must, to get its true meaning, be grasped in such a way that in it, as what is absolutely simple or unitary, the difference present in law as such themselves return again into the inner world as a simple unity. This unity is the inner necessity of the law. The law is thereby present in a twofold manner, once as law in which the differences are expressed as independent moments, and also in the form of a simple withdrawal into itself, which again can be called force, but in the sense not of a force that is driven back into itself, but force as such, or the notion of force, an abstraction which absorbs the differences themselves, or what attracts and what is attracted. In this sense, simple electricity, for example, force is force, but the expression of difference falls within the law. This difference is positive and negative electricity. In the case of the motion of falling, force is the simple factor gravity, whose law is that the magnitudes of the different moments of the motion, the time elapsed and the space traversed, are related to one another as root and square. Electricity itself is not a difference per se, or is not in its essence the dual essence of positive and negative electricity. Hence it is usually said that it has the law of this mode of being, and two, that it has the property of expressing itself in this way. It is true that this property is the essential and sole property of this force, or that it belongs to it necessarily. But necessity here is an empty word. Force must, just because it must, duplicate itself in this way. Of course, a given positive electricity, a negative too is given in principle, for the positive is only as related to a negative, or the positive is in its own self, the difference from itself, and similarly with the negative. But that electricity as such should divide itself in this way is not in itself a necessity. Electricity as simple force is indifferent to its law to be positive and negative, and if we call the former its notion, but the latter its being, then its notion is indifferent to its being. It merely has this property, which just means that this property is not in itself necessary to it. This indifference is given another form when it is said that to be positive and negative belongs to the definition of electricity, and that this is simply in notion and essence. In that case, its being would simply mean its actual existence. But that definition does not contain the necessity of its existence. It exists either because we find it, that is, its existence is not necessary at all, or else it exists through or by means of other forces, that is, its necessity is an external necessity, but in basing this necessity on the determinateness of being through another, we relapse again into the plurality of specific laws which we have just left behind in order to consider law as law. It is only with law as law that we are to compare its notion as notion, or its necessity. But in all these forms, necessity has shown itself to be only an empty word. There is still another form than that just indicated, in which the indifference of law and force or of notion and being, is to be found. In the law of motion, for example, it is necessary that motion be split up into time and space, or again into distance and velocity. Thus, since motion is only the relation of these factors, it, the universal, is essentially divided in its own self. But now these parts, time and space, or distance and velocity, do not in themselves express this origin in a one. They are indifferent to one another. Space is thought of as able to be without time, time without space, and distance at least without velocity, just as their magnitudes are indifferent to one another, since they are not related to one another as positive and negative, and thus we are not related to one another. They are not related to one another through their own essential nature. The necessity of the division is thus certainly present here, but not the necessity of the parts as such for one another. But it is just for this reason that first necessity, too, is itself only a sham, false necessity, for motion is not itself thought of as something simple, or as a pure essence, but as already divided. Time and space are in themselves its independent parts, or essences. Of distance and velocity are modes of being, or ways of thinking, either of which can well be without the other. And motion is therefore only their superficial relation, not their essence. If it is thought of as a simple essence, or as a force, motion is no doubt gravity, but this does not contain these differences at all. The difference then, in both cases, is not a difference in its own self. Either the universal force is indifferent to the division, which is the law, or the differences, the parts of the law, are indifferent to one another. The understanding, however, has the notion of this implicit difference, just because the law is, on the one hand, the inner implicit being, but is at the same time inwardly differentiated. That this difference is thus an inner difference follows from the fact that the law is a simple force, or is the notion of the difference, and is therefore a difference belonging to the notion. But this inner difference still falls, to begin with, still only within the understanding, and is not yet posited in the thing itself. It is therefore only its own necessity that is asserted by the understanding. The difference then is posited by the understanding in such a way that at the same time it is expressly stated that the difference is not a difference belonging to the thing itself. This necessity, which is merely verbal, is thus a recital of the moments constituting the cycle of the necessity. The moments are indeed distinguished, but at the same time their difference is expressly said to be not a difference of the thing itself, and consequently is itself immediately cancelled again. This process is called explanation. A law is enunciated from this. Its implicitly universal element or ground is distinguished as force, but it is said that this difference is no difference, rather that the ground is constituted exactly the same as the law. The single occurrence of lightning, for example, is apprehended as a universal, and this universal is enunciated as the law of electricity. The explanation then condenses the law into force as the essence of the law. This force then is so constituted that when it is expressed, opposite electricities appear, which disappear again into one another. That is, force is constituted exactly the same as law. There is said to be no difference whatever between them. The differences are the pure universal expressions of law and pure force, but both have the same content, the same constitution. Thus, the difference, qua differences of content of the thing, is also again withdrawn. In this tautological movement, the understanding, as we have seen, sticks to the inner unity of its object, and the movement falls only within the understanding itself, not within the object. It is an explanation that not only explains nothing, but is so plain that while it pretends to say something different from what has already been said, it really says nothing at all, but only repeats the same thing. In the thing itself, this movement gives rise to nothing new. It comes into consideration only as a movement of the understanding. In it, however, we detect the very thing that was missing in the law, namely the absolute flux itself. For this movement, when we look at it more closely, is directly the opposite of itself. That is to say, it posits a difference which is not only not a difference for us, but one which the movement itself cancels as a difference. This is the same flux which presented itself as the play of forces. This contained the distinction of soliciting and solicited force, or force expressing itself and force repressed into itself. But these were distinctions which in reality were no distinctions, and therefore were also immediately cancelled again. What is present here is not merely bare unity in which no difference would be posited, but rather a movement in which a distinction is certainly made, but because it is no distinction, is again cancelled. In the process, then, of explaining the to and fro of change, which before was outside of the inner world and present only in the appearance, has penetrated into the supersensible world itself, our consciousness, however, has passed over from the inner being as object to the other side into the understanding, and it experiences change there. Thus, this change is not yet a change of the thing itself, but rather presents itself as pure change by the very fact that the content of the moments of change, remains the same. But since the notion qua notion of the understanding is the same as the inner being of things, this change becomes for the understanding the law of the inner world. The understanding thus learns that it is the law of appearance itself, that differences arise which are no differences, and that what is a self-same repels itself from itself, and similarly that the differences are only such as are in reality no differences, and which cancel themselves. In other words, what is not self-same is self-attractive, and thus we have a second law, whose content is the opposite of what was previously called law, namely difference, which remains constantly self-same. For this new law expresses rather that like becomes unlike, and unlike becomes like. The notion demands of the thoughtless thinker that he bring both laws together and become aware of their antithesis. The second is certainly also a law, an inner self-identical being, but a self-sameness rather of the unlike, a permanence of impermanence. In the play of forces, this law showed itself to be precisely this absolute transition and pure change. The self-same, namely force, splits itself into an antithesis which at first appears to be an independent difference, but which in fact proves to be none. For it is the self-same which repels itself from itself, and therefore what is repelled is essentially self-attractive, for it is the same. The difference created, since it is no difference, therefore cancels itself again. Consequently, the difference exhibits itself as a difference of the thing itself, or as absolute difference. And this difference of the thing is thus nothing else but the self-same that has repelled itself from itself, and therefore merely posits an antithesis, which is none. Through this principle, the first supersensible world, the tranquil kingdom of laws, the immediate copy of the perceived world, is changed into its opposite. The law was, in general, like its differences, that which remained self-same. Now, however, it is posited that each of the two worlds is really the opposite of itself. The self-same really repels itself from itself, and what is not self-same really posits itself as self-same. In point of fact, it is only when thus determined that the difference is in a difference, or the difference in its own self, the like being unlike itself, and the unlike like itself. The second supersensible world is in the way the inverted world, and moreover, since one aspect is already present in the first supersensible world, the inversion of the first. With this, the inner world is completed as appearance, for the first supersensible world was only the immediate raising of the perceived world into the universal element. It had its necessary counterpart in this perceived world, which still retained for itself the principle of change and alteration. The first kingdom of laws lacked that principle, but obtains it as an inverted world. According, then, to the law of this inverted world, what is like in the first world is unlike to itself, and what is unlike in the first world is equally unlike to itself, or it becomes like itself. Expressed in determinate moments, this means that what in the law of the first world is sweet, in this inverted in itself is sour. What in the former is black, is in the other white. What in the law of the first the north pole of the magnet is, in the other supersensible in itself, namely in the earth the south pole. But what is there such south pole is here north pole. Similarly, what is in the first law is the oxygen pole of electricity, because in its other supersensible essence, hydrogen pole, and conversely, what is there the hydrogen pole becomes here the oxygen pole. In another sphere, revenge on the enemy is, according to the immediate law, the supreme satisfaction of the injured individuality. This law, however, which bids me confront him as himself a person who does not treat me as such, and in fact bids me destroy him as an individuality, this law is turned round by the principle of the other world into its opposite, the reinstatement of myself as a person through the destruction of the alien individuality is turned into self-destruction. If now this inversion, which finds expression in the punishment of crime, is made into a law, it too again is only the law of the one world, which is confronted by an inverted, supersensible world, where what is despised in the former is honoured, and what in the former is honoured meets with contempt. The punishment which under the law of the first world disgraces and destroys a man is transformed in its inverted world into the pardon which preserves his essential being and brings him to honour. Looked at superficially, this inverted world is the opposite of the first in the sense that it has the latter outside of it and repels that world from itself as an inverted actual world. That the one is appearance, but the other the in itself. That the one is the world as it is for another, whereas the other is the world as it is for itself. So that to use the previous examples, what tastes sweet is really or inwardly in the thing sour, or what is North Pole in the actual magnet in the world of appearance would be South Pole in the inner or essential being. What presents itself as oxygen pole in the phenomenon of electricity would be hydrogen pole in unmanifested electricity, or an action which in the world of appearance is a crime would in the inner world be capable of being really good. A bad action may be well intentioned. Punishment is punishment only in the world of appearance, in itself or in another world. It may be a benefit for the criminal, but such antitheses of inner and outer, of appearance and the supersensible, as of the two different kinds of actuality, we no longer find here. The repelled differences are not shared afresh between two substances, such as would support them and lend them a separate subsistence. This would result in the understanding withdrawing from the inner world and relapsing into its previous position. The one side or substance would be the world of perception, again in which one of the two laws would be operative, and confronting it would be an inner world, just such a sense world as the first, but in the imagination. It could not be exhibited as a sense world, could not be seen, heard or tasted, and yet it would be thought of as such a sense world. But in fact, if the one posited world is a perceived world, and it's in itself, as its inversion, is equally thought of as sensuous, then sourness, which would be the in itself, or the sweet thing, is actually a thing just as much as the latter, namely a sour thing. Black, which would be the in itself, or of white, is an actual black. The North Pole, which is the in itself of the South Pole, is the North Pole actually present in the same magnet. The oxygen pole, which is the in itself of the hydrogen pole, is actually present in the same voltaic pile. The actual crime, however, has its inversion and its in itself as possibility in the intention as such, but not in a good intention, for the truth of intention is only the act itself. But the crime, as regards its content, has its reflection into self, or its inversion, in the actual punishment. This is the reconciliation of the law with the actuality opposed to it in the crime. Finally, the actual punishment has its inverted actuality present in it in such a way that the punishment is an actualization of the law, whereby the activity exercised by the law as punishment suspends itself, and from being active, the law becomes again quiescent and is vindicated, and the conflict of individuality with it and of it with individuality is extinguished.